panel will be moderated by Keith Maub, the Senior Managing Director of Mackinac Partners. So we will be bringing our chairs to the stage, and you're all welcome to join us.
At the recent TMA annual DIC, I gave a few remarks about this being the year of the shitty companies. And some of that was retweeted out and the like, probably more for the colorful language that was used rather than the quality of the comment itself. But there is sort of a thing that's going on now where the uncertainty around immigration reform, labor reform, wage reform, tax reform, all is sort of leading to a place where there is just a lot of uncertainty around a lot of the macro factors that most of us would be dealing with in our turnaround lives. And I don't think that's anywhere more prevalent than it is in the restaurant and casual dining space. So I think this morning's panel will be great. I think I want to interact a lot. We're hopeful for a lot of questions. Real quickly, to my left, you're right, Jeff Krause is a partner at Gibson Dunn. We've worked with Jeff and been very close with him and his firm over many years. It doesn't require a lot of introduction, as do really any of these folks on this panel. But has been a great friend of Mackinac and a great colleague to work with, and one of the real true talented commercial restructuring lawyers that I and I think our firm would echo have ever had the pleasure of working with. Next to Jeff is Bob Rykoff. Bob is the principal at TDN2K. For those of you who follow the restaurant space, you'll recognize the black box analytics. That's one of their products. Very highly respected analytics tracking firm around the restaurant and casual dining space. So a lot of good data, and we all love the rich data environment. Seth Herman is the senior vice president at Jefferies. Jefferies, as you all know, is a major investment bank, broad restructuring capabilities, broad restructuring practice. And again, we've worked closely with Seth and his team on a number of the restaurant situations. And then at the far end, Dimitri Cohen. Dimitri is a principal with Raven Capital. Raven recently was the dip provider and then the exit financing source for Macaroni Grill that recently exited successfully Chapter 11 here just about a month ago, 45 days ago.
Effective date February 15th.
There we go. So a lot of real current knowledge here. So let's kick it off. Let's get into the data. We'll start with the analytics first. And Bob, if you'll tell us a little bit about the state of the state.
Happy to do that. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here with all of you today. So thanks for having this panel, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. You know, there's so many interesting and challenging things happening in the restaurant industry today, and I'm hard pressed to go back 10 or 15 or 20 years to find a time when things weren't very challenging or interesting in the restaurant business. But with regulation, availability of capital, labor, healthcare, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different things that are happening. Heard a couple different people talk this morning already about change and the speed of change and things happening quickly. And I think that's complicating the restaurant business even more than some other industries. So changing consumer tastes, changing markets, the fragmentation of restaurant markets is making it very difficult for people who are in this business to try to stay current. The other element that I think is we need to address is technology, because not only is it addressing the way restaurants operate internally, but the way restaurants communicate with their customers. So think about online, think about loyalty programs, and then of course the whole world of social, where brands have largely lost the ability to create their own content, and the content is largely being determined by the online community. Keith talked about uncertainty, and I know there's uncertainty in every part of the business today. And uncertainty is not the businessman's friend, for sure. So restaurant companies are not sure what's going to happen with immigration. They're not sure what's going to happen with joint employer. They're not sure what's going to happen with healthcare. They're not sure what's going to happen with FLSA. And without having at least a little bit of idea what's going on there, it makes it more difficult to plan long term and understand exactly how you need to be positioning yourself going forward. So we have a lot of data. I don't have a lot of charts. I'm going to try to make sure this is top level, and we can talk more in detail about this anytime you'd like. I think it's fair to say that in spite of a pretty strong economy for the last couple of years, chain restaurants have not prospered. And our database tells us that comp sales, while they were up modestly in 2014 and 15, were actually down in 2016, 2017, and so far in 2018 as well. Now, when I say restaurant industry, I'm talking about same-store sales, which is really how the restaurant industry gauges itself. It's restaurants that have been open for 18 months, and there is not strength in any particular segment, and that includes fast casual, which has been kind of the darling of the investment community over time. So fast casual has had its difficulties with same-store sales. There is pretty much consensus within our business that there are too many restaurant seats in the marketplace. There's a lot of overcapacity, and that varies by market, but in general, there seems to be more restaurants than there is demand for it. We're opening restaurants at a faster pace than population growth, and there's certainly adding to the total sales of restaurants, but that total sales of chain restaurants is coming from the addition of new units and not from the existing base. And I need to point out right now, when we talk about this base of restaurants, we track 30,000 restaurants on a weekly basis from 170 different brands. And there's a wide disparity of performance, as you might imagine. The difference between top performers and bottom performers is often 6, 8, 9%. So when I talk about this, understand there are pockets of strength out there, and there are some restaurant brands that are doing quite well. And they're legacy brands, they're new brands. Don't think that they're young, old, big, small. They operate well, they've got a presence, they understand their business. I would say that probably 35 to 40% of our brands over the last 2 years have had positive comp sales. So the majority of brands have had a difficult time with comp sales in the past couple of years. The big story here is a lack of traffic. And since TD and 2K started monitoring this 8 or 9 years ago, I don't think there's been a positive year of traffic. Certainly it's been down for the last 5 years. In 2016 and 2017, it was down about 3%. So you can imagine for a brand that is perhaps weaker, as the continual trickle of consumer traffic comes down, it provides opportunities, because if they don't have headroom in their balance sheet or financial resources, it's a pretty difficult environment for them. So the way that comp sales have maintained any kind of even positive, zero is the new up in a lot of cases, is by check average, which is either price increases or menu mix. And the industry has done a pretty remarkable job, if you think about all the traffic that's been lost, just to keep sales at a top level. But they've also had to cut the middle. They've worked on things in the P&L in order to make sure that the margins could be maintained as the economics of the restaurant change. So you'll see, menu engineering, you'll see labor scheduling, you see the introduction of technology, you see new prototypes trying to address the fact that the top and the bottom line are being squeezed by the lack in traffic growth.
And in that process, you see a lot of errors. The whole menu
It's trial and error.
re-engineering process,
Yeah.
and the idea that because from an operational perspective, as we all know, that also then drives through the challenges of training and education and how you make that excellent when you're trying to constantly hit the mark from both an experience and a food menu perspective. So sorry to interrupt you, but
No, that's quite all right. There are value menus going out. It's a real difficult marketplace. We could spend hours talking about what's happening and why this is going on, and we don't have enough time today. But certainly the market is more fragmented. People have more choice with food today. They can go to grocery stores, they can go to convenience stores, they can go to food trucks, they can go to kiosks, they can get meal kits. And the successful firms are those that are identifying which parts of the fragmented marketplace appeal to them. And in some cases, it's a function of being in the right place. So for example, the day part that's making sense today in terms of growth is breakfast. And if you've got a brand or a concept that can be relevant in that space, you've got heads up on perhaps a fine dining brand that can't take advantage of that.
who's doing that well?
For sure,
anybody that sees
the
somebody
quick
that
service
can-
folks are doing pretty well.
Yeah.
And the family dining people. Of course, they've owned that place for a while. The IHOPs, the Denny's, and folks, but that's a brand. Are we taking questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, Pat.
Keith, Bob, what is the future of fine dining based on your statistics?
Fine dining is actually doing pretty well. And we have a fine dining segment. We have 6 segments from fine dining to QSR. But fine dining is actually a pocket of strength. Now, there's not as many of the restaurants. In our database, there's only 350 or so because there's just not that concentration. But it has been one of the better performing segments over the last couple of years, in all honesty. So in terms of the marketplace, there's been certainly a marked movement from traditional casual sit-down dining to what I probably would call healthier or perceived healthier, or higher quality, think smash burger, five guys, with a special emphasis on speed and convenience. That doesn't mean table service is dead, because there'll always be a place for it, but it does point out how difficult it is to remain relevant to your core market and still appeal to some of these changing demographics and some of these changing needs. And the final point I'll bring up before we turn it over is something that you're not going to find on the P&L. We track not only sales performance, but HR metrics and social commentary. And we have found that in social commentary, there's a pretty close linkage between the service element in restaurants and performance. Today's environment in the labor market is perhaps the #1 issue for restaurants. They can't get staffed. This is an era of low employment. Everybody who's got a job wants a job. Turnover at the hourly level in restaurants is probably 125, 130%. At managers, it's over 40%. Average manager, 35% of them leave within a year. 40% of your hourly employees leave within the first 90 days. So as people try to attract, retain, assess, onboard folks, it becomes all the more difficult to achieve that important service element that is so critical in the performance side of restaurants. So as you take a look at restaurants, I would certainly urge you from what we see to make sure that you're paying attention to the people side as well as the financial side.
Yeah, I think, and again, this is building on a theme that some prior panels that we worked on. The whole labor picture, particularly in the unskilled labor sector, is something we all ought to be paying an awful lot of attention to. There's I don't want to argue the political discussion around mandatory E-Verify or voluntary E-Verify, but if we get to a place of mandatory E-Verify, the labor pool in this country is going to shrink dramatically. And that's going to couple with the things that Bob is talking about in terms of the labor pressures that already exist today. A growing economy obviously always puts pressure on the availability of labor. And again, if you think about higher wage jobs in construction and manufacturing versus the service sectors and the pressure that that's going to put on casual dining in particular from a labor perspective, it's going to be pretty dramatic. Seth, what's your crystal ball say about rates? What's it say about the opportunity for restructuring opportunities in the sector coming into 2018 and maybe even a little bit into 2019, and what deals can get done?
Well, market rates are not my forte as a restructuring advisor,
but you're an investment banker.
I'm honest. But from a capital markets perspective, one can look at the public markets and particularly in the QSR space. I mean, the valuations are quite rich. And even in casual dining, if one were to just focus on the median line, one would say, oh, this is a little bit north of the historical average. But as Bob alluded to, it's very much a market of haves and have-nots here. And from a private market perspective, which is really what matters in these stressed and distressed situations, I think that's probably even more so the case. So, there are differentiated concepts with strong unit economics, lots of white space, and opportunities for either franchising or licensing. And you're seeing multiples of 10 times plus. So for instance, in Fogo de Chao, where they have a very interesting labor model where it tends to be 10 points less of labor cost versus other concepts, and they recently had a buyout offer for like 10.5 times. But on the other hand, these undifferentiated concepts with struggling brands, it's an entirely different market. So a couple of those more recently have been Ruby Tuesdays, and that deal was done around 6 times, but that was really a real estate play. So when you think about how the capital markets were thinking about that as a restaurant concept, I think that skews that data point quite a bit. There was very little value for the restaurant operations. Brio Bravo was another one that I'm sure has hit a number of folks' radars on their stressed and distressed screeners. That was recently an announced deal which was south of 5 times, and there, I mean, even there was an angle where there's supposed to be a rebranding at the Brio concept. There's expected to be a number of store closures and the like. So capital is very selective in the current market environment, and that's something that kind of plays into how do you go about trying to find capital to either effectuate some sort of runway extension strategy or during the course of full-blown restructuring, which we'll get into.
Yeah. Dimitri, as we again think about where smart money wants to go, and I consider you all smart money, what are you looking for in this space? Obviously, Mac Grill, you're a big supporter and believe in that business. Give us some ideas and thoughts about what you all are looking at and what you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't think all these opportunities are the same, and we are more frightful than, I guess, courageous to go into the restaurant space. Our firm tries to find unique opportunities with credit enhancements that aren't potentially on the surface, whether it's something that's like Ruby Tuesdays where there is a real estate component that's very obvious, or other credit enhancements that are less obvious, whether it's certain licenses or contracts that are better in certain situations, or sponsors or owners of of the businesses that are stronger and are supportive. We try to get enhancements to our investments that way. But as you've heard all this data, the biggest differentiator is the management team, and it's not. More people are doing things exactly the same the wrong way than actually looking at the change in the space. Third-party delivery, for example, it's driving Macaroni Grill's turnaround. It's still early. We're just emerged, as Jeff said, on the 15th. But this is a brand that we've asked many people about what happened to it. And a lot of people in this room probably will respond the same exact way, because I was surprised that everybody did. Oh, I loved that place. Whatever happened to that? I used to go there all the time. The Honor Bar or the Honor Wine service was great. My kids could run around, do whatever they want, and then we stopped going. But why, right? And so you dig deeper in that question. People still like the brand, still like the food, but have way more options of where to go now, and at the same time, the service and the quality deteriorated from that brand. But yet, now that you can get it delivered to your house on a stormy day, where before our same-store sales would be just deteriorated when there was a big storm, now we're driving growth. Everybody in the restructuring space is looking, how do I reduce certain costs out of the business so that I can get to an EBITDA number where I can achieve a 10 times multiple like the best players in the space? But it's not really fixing the problem of the top line, right? And so as you see these new potential revenue drivers, we try to focus on brands that still have value. And I mean, Keith, the real thing that we look for is a management team that has experience, has done it, and has worked with us potentially more than once, because we know how they react when there's bumps in the road, and there's going to be bumps in the road.
Sure. Pitfalls? The protection element of the process and things that you're seeing that are problematic?
Well, let me describe a little bit why the restaurant industry is similar to retail but different than retail in terms of the ability to buy time out of court or once you're in court. And in lots of ways, it's similar to retail in the sense that there's a top-line problem, and that, as Dimitri said, you can't just cut costs out of the business. You have to find a way to manage the top line. And for many restaurant chains, it was true of Romano's, and it's true, I think, of the majority of retail chains, notwithstanding things like Ruby Tuesday. Most of their premises are leased, like most retail places are leased. And if you have to cut loose the losing stores, it comes back to same-store sales and how do you manage the stores that are not in good locations or not succeeding, or in the mall where half of the retail stores are closing and the foot traffic's not there anymore. You have to close those stores, you have to deal with those lessors. And so that can be a challenge in retail, it can be a challenge in the restaurant space. And one example of that in Hermanos, we had about 40 store locations that closed pre-petition. We were able to negotiate out-of-court arrangements with 70% of the landlords in those locations. The problem was the other 30% of the landlords, their total claims, if you didn't apply the bankruptcy code limitations on claims and you didn't get them to buy into the concept they were only going to get fractional dollars because that's what they would get into Chapter 11, their damage claims were well north of $10, $15 million that had to be dealt with. That is true in retail when you close stores because of same-store sales. The areas that are different, though, are important, and probably the biggest one, and the one that Raven was able to come up with a creative package for in the Chapter 11 financing, is the collateral package. In the restaurant business, the leases and the liquor licenses are among the most important valuable assets you've got. In some jurisdictions, they're very valuable. If you close a store and you sell the liquor license, it can bring hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they're, in most jurisdictions, cannot be subjected to a lien. The leases themselves cannot be subjected to liens in most instances because the lessor isn't going to consent to a lien. So you have a collateral package that is not everything that you need to run the restaurants and not all of the valuable assets. And that is very different than a retail where the collateral is mostly the inventory in the stores. The other area is labor, and it's labor in restaurants where people are paid a reduced minimum wage because they get a tip credit because they receive tips. There is a trend going on now. It's happened in 3 Chapter 11 cases recently, including ours, and it's happening in chains outside of Chapter 11, that there are a group of class action plaintiffs lawyers filing Fair Labor Standards Act claims for the allegation that people are getting paid the tipped reduced minimum wage for time that they're not working in a tipped job. And so they say that they should be paid the base minimum wage as opposed to the reduced minimum wage, the normal non-tip minimum wage. And it's about a $5 difference, and it's $5 for every employee who receives tips for every shift back for 3 years prior to now. And in the context of a Chapter 11, during the 6 months pre-petition, so that time period would be a priority claim, and during the period of administration. And so the priority claim and the administrative claim would need to be paid in full in cash, and that puts them ahead of all of the general unsecured creditors. Their theory is, I think, not well-founded as a matter of labor law, but they're submitting the claims, and they submitted a claim in Romano's, and in Romano's, we had an arbitration agreement with our employees. When an employee signed on, they signed on that they had to arbitrate, and as a result, the district court had said no class action. People have to go do their individual arbitrations. The bankruptcy judge, Judge Walrath, actually also said, second reason for no class action, every single employee's facts are different. If you think about the factual issue, and it's one of the problems with the claims, it's did this employee work on non-tipped work for a substantial part of each of their shifts? So it's employee-specific, shift-specific, restaurant-specific. How do you do a class action when it depends on the individual people? And at the end of the day, the class action was not permitted in Romano's, but the lawyers who had filed the class action in state court filed 1,400 individual proofs of claim based on opt-ins they had gotten in the pre-petition litigation. And so we had to deal with 1,400 individual claims, which they asserted were all priority claims because they didn't know how many of the employees worked for us during the 6 months pre-petition. And so going back to the turnover rates, they'd gotten the opt-ins 2 years pre-petition. 40 of the 1,400 employees worked for us during the 6 months pre-petition. And because of that, we were able to resolve the claims. But it's been a big problem in multiple recent restaurant cases, and I think that the class action plaintiffs' lawyers are likely to continue pursuing it. There's a Supreme Court case this year on whether arbitration clauses are permissible in the employment context or whether you cannot prevent employees from class action litigation. Hopefully the Supreme Court will say they are valid, but that means in the restaurant space, employers need to be getting arbitration provisions from their employees to avoid the class action process.
And Jeff, right there, that's a perfect example of a management team knowing and getting out ahead of it versus dealing with a problem down the road, right? And in Romano's, because the arbitration agreement was there, was incredibly helpful and reduced significant cost to the entire bankruptcy.
But getting out ahead of it's a challenge. And, you know, there are pockets of this FSLA compliance, particularly California, a few other states, where there's developing this very, very problematic plaintiff's bar, not only around chapter situations, but also around, you know, just normal operations where you're kind of on this constant threat of litigation. And this 3-year rolling window, you can almost expect with the expiration of, you know, the last settlement and 3 years hence, you're on somebody's radar, and here it comes again, because the cost and the complexity of compliance in this stuff, it's overwhelming.
And in our case, they actually had an investment advisor for the class whose job it is to serve on creditors committees and advise the individual employee serving on the creditors committee, and he's done it in at least 4 Chapter 11 cases. So it's definitely an area where they're different than retail, but the collateral package and the liquor licenses and the difficulty of how do you lean that up out of a proceeding, how do you protect a secured lender who's willing to provide bridge financing when you can't pledge to them the liquor licenses and you can't pledge to them the leases, I think makes it more challenging to keep restaurants out of court, and more of a need for a filing to address. In a DIP loan, you can provide that collateral package or priority to the proceeds of that collateral package at least.
Yeah, just jumping on, in terms of financeable assets that can be utilized outside of court, you know, obviously everyone's been focused for the last year and change on intellectual property and finding a way to finance off of that to extend runway. And it's really only been seen in the retail space. You know, J. Crew, I think, is kind of the seminal case everyone's been focused on. And, you know, that's a strategy that its applicability really varies depending on the brand and a number of other factors. But, you know, while there haven't been too many more transactions in that space, probably in part due to continuing litigation around J. Crew. You know, Claire's kind of got away with it. There is certainly the opportunity to do similar type things in restaurant situations. I think the reason why we haven't seen that is the types of folks who are under duress in the restaurant space are not the folks that have the ability to easily monetize you know, franchise fees and, you know, brand value as easily. But it's certainly something that's subject to document restrictions and the like, you know, could be on the come with some of these more distressed cases. And when I think about monetizing IP, I mean, it's not just, you know, securitizing existing license streams. It's also refranchising. You know, it's also potentially entering into new franchise agreements, and all these things have potential challenges, right? Like when you think about the unit economic model of a restaurant, you know, you kind of need, you know, a 20% type restaurant EBITDA margin in order to be able to burden that with a 6-7% royalty and have it make sense for the franchisee. But I think that's all interesting to think about as you think of prospective opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And mentioning the franchising reminded me, they're the other main difference with restaurants. And if you're a franchised restaurant chain, that's an issue because the franchisor is ultimately going to need to buy into whatever the restructuring is. Franchise agreements, it's harder to assign them. There's an argument that they are non-exclusive licenses of a trademark that can't be assigned without the consent of the franchisor, and as a practical matter, the franchisor has an interest that the franchisee is actually running the restaurant up to standards. But there are other priority creditors in a restaurant case that create challenges for both the secured lender and a debtor seeking financing. There's PACA, Perishable Agricultural Commodity Act Trust Fund claims for produce supplied to restaurants. There's PASA, which is meat supplied to restaurants. There's the lessors that have to be dealt with. There are the priority employee claims. There are sales tax claims and the employee tax claims. So if you wind up, and they're critical vendors, and oftentimes restaurants have a supply contract with an individual vendor that provides a vast majority of their food product. All of those creditors are going to have to be taken care of, which means that the secured lender is effectively in a situation where other creditors are ahead of them as a practical business matter, and they can't be assuming they're just going to get all of the value of the property except in a liquidation. And a restaurant, the other area where restaurants are different than retail is a restaurant liquidation is always a bad outcome.
Yeah, and I think the idea of critical vendors in restaurant restructurings is sort of automatic. Right. You're beholden, the consolidation of the food suppliers. You're beholden to, you're beholden to a few suppliers and the like, and the concept of again, you're right, from a secured creditor's perspective, you're standing behind all that unsecured debt in all likelihood, and for the practical purposes. So, I just got the 5-minute wave, so I'm going to look out there and see if there's any pressing or really, this is your opportunity to ask the really smart question. Anybody got a thought or a question in the field? I want to, not seeing that then, I want to come back maybe full circle to where Bob and I sort of started a bit, and this labor thing. Because I do believe, as we were chatting over here for breakfast, it is the challenge for the next couple of years. So, Bob, maybe why don't you kick it off? Thoughts on how you think smart operators are dealing with the issue today, either from a comp model perspective. Something I hadn't heard of. I heard this brilliant idea. Student loan debt is a really big issue in this company, in this country going forward. As a benefit, people coming out of college today value much more assistance with their student loan burden than they do their health care benefits. And in that package of developing benefits for employees, I haven't heard of it before, but the concept of using student loan assistance as a concept of that. So what are some other brilliant ideas that are out there?
Boy, I don't know about brilliant ideas, but that's an interesting one. The whole area of benefits is one that people spend an awful lot of time on, whether it's pet insurance or some other issue like that. I wish that there was a magic solution to some of the labor issues. But if we take a look at some of the successful organizations, unfortunately, this is not the kind of thing that you can turn around on a dime, because so much of it is a company culture. It's the way that the brand expresses itself. It's the way that leadership interacts with the people on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And so many companies that are trying different things don't have the time to do some of the things that it takes long-term to establish trust, a relationship, knowing that I've got your back, knowing that I'm going to take care of you to the extent that I can. So, personally, what I see a lot of is organizations that are really good at this know who they are. They have a brand identity. They have a brand relevance. They can explain it. There's a history. There's a story. Millennials want to hear a story. They want to be connected to people that have a story to tell. They don't just want a job. They want to know that they're working for an organization that does more than just take care of people on a day-to-day basis. So it's inculcating this culture that appeals to folks and is also consistent with being a good steward in the community. And I realize that's kind of hyperbole and maybe sounds grandiose, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of truth to making sure that you're taking care of people in an environment that promotes that kind of feeling and that family orientation.
Dimitri?
I think all those things also need an investment partner that allows the time for those to be implemented. A lot of the terms that we put together for this deal and others are management friendly, that a kind of loan-to-own potential competitor of ours would very quickly trigger potentially some kind of covenant or liquidity default, and then, like Jeff said, would turn to potential liquidation opportunities that would arise quicker. So what we have seen is that you need to have a management team that gives people a reason to want to go to work, right?
Right.
And when same-store sales are down and down and down, it becomes pretty depressing. And when we've seen just a couple days in a row of up, people are like pumped up. They're excited. They're on a team. At the end of the day, they're on a team and they want to come to work. And when you have that centralized message and that motivation, at least so far, we've seen it be successful.
One of the issues is the cycle of labor costs go up, minimum wages go up, you have to pay more. The way people try and address that in the short run is cut staffing. And when you cut staffing, you're expecting somebody, if you already have the ideal staffing level, you're expecting somebody to do more than they can actually do in their shift, or to provide poorer service to customers. And in the restaurant industry, it's all about the service and the experience that the customer has. And so you can't cut hours out to make up for the added costs. You have to find some way to motivate people. And cutting hours and laying people off is probably the antithesis of motivating the people.
That's false economy.
Okay, last question then that Seth gets this one. Good year for restaurant restructurings, bad year? My shitty company's comment aside.
I think this kind of plays into what we're talking about, where these are businesses that can melt down very quickly, and there's certainly a lot of leverage in the space in a way that this year could be a pretty interesting year.
Yeah. So up or down over 17?
Up from our perspective,
Yeah.
or up for the industry?
Up from our number of restructurings. Up. I vote way up. Way up. Yeah. Last call for questions. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.